Well, this is a really exciting evening for me. I don't think I've been this excited since my bar mitzvah. I have read and adored Ron Brownstein's book, Rock Me on the Water. And I have read and adored Jennifer Armstrong's book, When Women Invented Television. And they are perfect recital of moments in time in history. There's a great quote that Ron has in his book by Peter Bogdanovich, which says, "The past is present." And I think it's certainly true of Jennifer's book, as we see the resurgence and the power of women in the television business. And as you read along the extraordinary events of 1974, which are covered in an amazingly wonderful detail and interesting way in Ron's book, you really do have a sense that there is this cultural change that suggests that the political, the social, and the way we live is going to be inevitably influenced by what's going on at the moment. And you really do see Ron run through this, this amazing story of people that we really cared about. It is impossible to read Ron's book without going to Spotify and downloading Jackson Browne and the Eagles and similar artists of that era. I have watched Chinatown and Shampoo in the last 5 nights to kind of really get into the experience of it. So you're in for a lovely, wonderful, interesting conversation. I'm so grateful to Jennifer and Ron for being here. And I'll stop talking and start listening. So thank you both for being here.
Thank you for having us.
Absolutely.
Should we dive in with questions?
Yes, I think.
All right. So especially because this is an LA-based crowd, I was thinking about how this book, you sort of set up 1974 Los Angeles as what I think of as like the golden hour. You know, it's like, you know, that time in filming when the light is perfect. It's a little window. It's gonna, you know, it's gonna go. Maybe they hoped it wouldn't go away at that time, but you kind of know it's gonna go away. And we know with retrospect that it is. When everything was kind of just perfect, conditions were perfect to make great television, movies, and music that have real artistry and real progressive messages in 1974. And that's the story of this book. So maybe start us out with just what made this time so special.
First of all, thank you guys at Chevaliers for doing this. Jennifer, thank you for doing this with your own terrific book out and taking the time. So I think, you know, what happened in Los Angeles in the early 1970s was, and particularly in 1974, as kind of the culmination of forces that have been developing for a while, was a combination of cultural change and economic change, I think. You know, part of my story is that you kind of have to look at the 60s to understand the 70s. And both the movie industry and the TV networks spent the 1960s doing their best to ignore everything that was happening around them. You know, as I write in the book, Walter Cronkite would spend half an hour each night documenting all of the new fissures opening in American life. And then CBS and the other 2 networks would spend the next 3.5 hours trying to erase it from people's minds. I mean, you know, we were still getting the Beverly Hillbillies and Petticoat Junction and Green Acres and Andy Griffith. We didn't get any closer to Vietnam and Gomer Pyle and McHale's Navy and Hogan's Heroes. And the studios really weren't that different. I mean, there was the big moment of Bonnie and Clyde and The Graduate in '67, but even that wasn't a lasting change. And for most of the decade, when all of this incredible drama is happening really right there, right then in America, we got The Longest Day, The Great Escape. I love The Great Escape, but it was not a contemporary movies. The Sound of Music, Mary Poppins, and all of it looking away, and all of it really, and some version of the theory that you also wrote about in your book on Mary Tyler Moore, Sally Bedell wrote about, of the least objectionable program. The idea that the audience was so concentrated at that point. It's the opposite of where we are now. You needed such big audiences in order to survive. The theory was you got to produce stuff that was offensive to the least possible number of people. And in effect, that meant that kind of small town, rural, culturally conservative America got a veto. And you see this begin to change first in music, then in movies with Bonnie and Clyde and the Graduate, then with Easy Rider, then with a lot of what comes earlier in the 70s, and then finally in television with the decisions by CBS to put Mary Tyler Moore, and really more significantly, All in the Family on the air in fall 70 and January 71. And what changes it in each case is that the networks and the studios and the music industry are responding to the fact that young people are an increasing part of their audience, and they have to produce pop culture that reflects the values and experiences of that new audience, which I think is relevant to where we are today. So that answers the first question of like, why was there this upsurge in socially relevant art in the early 1970s? And I think it was in each case because the industries felt that they had to connect with an audience, and we can talk more about it in each instance, with an audience who was demanding. Who really did not want Jed Clampett, anymore. But then the question becomes, all right, well, if that happened, why LA? And here's the thing, like, whether I'm talking about movies, music, or television, so many people I interviewed, and I interviewed over 100 people. I interviewed everyone from James Brooks and Norman Lear, to Warren Beatty and Jane Fonda, to Jackson Browne and Linda Ronstadt and Graham Nash, Irving Azoff. So many of them used a version of the same word, open, right? I mean, Irving Azoff and someone else, actually, Mary Kay Place, both described to me almost in the exact same words, graduating from college, or in Azoff's case, kind of outgrowing his hometown, where he was in Champaign, Illinois, and being with their car and deciding, do I turn left and seek my fortune in New York, or do I turn right and seek my fortune in LA? And both of them deciding on LA because LA seemed more open to new ideas, to new people. New York just felt kind of more regimented. Jackson Browne talked about, as you saw in the book, this being a period where not only were artists collaborating with each other, but you were kind of hanging out with the agents and the producers and the executives. There was a sense of ferment. Rob Reiner telling me the story about how, even when he was doing the Smothers Brothers, he was writing on the Smothers Brothers, which was pretty cutting edge in its time. All of his counterculture friends thought he was a sellout. But when All in the Family came out, like, even they were impressed. And there was a kind of friendly competition between MASH and Mary Tyler Moore and All in the Family. So I would say that there was an economic incentive for why there was a turn toward more socially relevant art, but there was a cultural reason why it was emerging in LA rather than somewhere else.
And this kind of leads us to your big thesis here of the whole book, right? Which is just that this is, and this is the part that blew my mind as a person who pays a lot of attention to all of this. Just that kind of, this is the moment, this is the turning point, right? Like, things change. And while of course you get Jaws and bigger sort of popcorn hits afterwards and stuff, the way that, politics and Hollywood come together, and especially that progressiveness, kind of sticks and never totally leaves us. And this is really when that idea of kind of the crazy liberals in LA who are trying to influence you really comes into the mainstream. Yeah, no. So,
what would really, I think the pop culture of the early 1970s was the bridge between a lot of the ideas that emerged in the social movements of the 60s and the mass American audience. The baby boom was never as preponderantly, we can talk about this, the baby boom was never as preponderantly liberal as it was portrayed to be. In fact, 1972 was the first year of exit polls, and Richard Nixon won most white people under the age of 30 in that 1972 election. But while the baby boom was not politically as liberal as it was made out to be, the social movements of the 60s were driven by the left side of the baby boom. And they introduced into the bloodstream a lot of ideas that, as we were talking about, were not there in the pop culture of the 60s. I mean, ideas like greater suspicion of authority in business and government, more autonomy for women, changing relations between men and women, changing attitudes about family and marriage and sex, more assertion, demand for inclusion among groups that have been marginalized, whether it was Black people or Hispanic people or gay people, the first stirrings of the environmental movement. All of these ideas kind of emerged in the 60s, were essentially ignored or marginalized in the culture that the big cultural institutions were producing in the 60s. But in the process that I describe in the book, really begin to infuse, whether it's Five Easy Pieces and Carnal Knowledge and The Godfather and Godfather 2 and Chinatown and The Conversation, or All in the Family. I mean, I think All in the Family, the fundamental storyline of All in the Family is these terms of surrender by the older generation to the new rules being set by the younger generation. I mean, Archie is giving ground every week. Archie gives another inch every week. Doesn't like it. He bellows about it, but he is giving ground. And so all of these ideas become dominant in popular culture. And the irony, the paradox, and what is, I think, actually a very revealing paradox, is that even as these ideas are triumphing in popular culture, Richard Nixon wins 2 elections by mobilizing the voters who don't like any of them, don't like any of this change, what he called his silent majority. And there's an important lesson there, because the triumph of these ideas in culture didn't mean, obviously, that there was a left triumph in politics. I mean, Nixon won 2 elections, Reagan won 2 elections. They both won by mobilizing as I say, the voters who least liked the way the country was changing. So they showed, as Trump did, that there is often a big audience for the idea that you're going to make all of this stop. And you can even at times win elections with that. What you can't actually do is make it stop, right? And it wasn't like after Nixon and Reagan won that we went back to the Donna Reed show in the way people were living their lives, or we went back to Black people being functionally invisible in kind of white society. Or we went back to people trusting the government and business to tell them the truth. So the changes that were cemented into popular culture in the early 1970s have become so much a part of our mental architecture that we can't imagine that there was a time before them. But as even in your work, I mean, you look at Travis Silverman's story. I mean, there was a time before all of these ideas were widely accepted. And it really is the legacy of the culture produced in the early 70s that it was the bridge that brought them to the mainstream in America.
So let's talk about All in the Family a little bit, since you brought that up. I think it's fascinating too, because I think TV maybe had the biggest hill to climb. I don't know, you can tell me differently, but like in terms of actually being regarded, like you said, we're coming out of, I Dream of Jeannie and Gomer Pyle and stuff. I mean, 60s television is just mind blowing. And then suddenly you get All in the Family, which really, is kind of a miracle, as you talk about in the book. Can you talk about how this show kind of came to be and blew everything up?
Yeah, first of all, I will say that if everything I write about in the book, in all of the interviews I've done and in all of the responses I've gotten on Twitter and elsewhere, All in the Family is what resonates the most 50 years later, because so many people remember understanding it even at the time as something fundamentally different than they'd ever seen before. I mean, people would write to me about watching it with their parents and being like, what did he just say? And I think, more than anything else, I mean, some of the music, Chinatown, I think it is what, and even more than Mary Tyler Moore or MASH, it is what symbolized that something was changing in what television was. And, what's striking about All in the Family, and many things striking about All in the Family, the first thing that's striking to me is that it is CBS that ends up putting it on, because CBS was the network that above all had triumphed on the opposite strategy. James Aubrey, who was the head of the network, brilliant and utterly dysfunctional, and, kind of a Me Too suit waiting to happen. he was, I think he was a Princeton graduate. He was a connoisseur of fine art and fine wine, but he was the one who said Beverly Hillbillies, Petticoat Junction, just kind of this assembly line of numbing, mindless sitcoms, right? And when CBS first tries to dip its toe into the changing culture, it's with the Smothers Brothers. And that is just a war. I mean, CBS kind of wanted to try something new, but they were not ready for, Waist Deep in the Big Muddy or Harry Belafonte and everything else that Tom and Dick Smothers were trying to bring there. And eventually they cancel it. And what's striking is the guy who cancels the Smothers Brothers in 1969 is also the person who puts All in the Family on the air, not very much later. And his name is Robert Wood. And that is the second part of this story that is so remarkable, is that the two men who above all caused All in the Family to go on the air were Robert Wood and Norman Lear. We remember the second, very few people remember the first. And both of them were utterly unlikely revolutionaries. I think people would be surprised to hear me say that. I mean, we think of Norman Lear as the visionary who transformed television. And in many ways, that's exactly what he was. But there was very little in his career until All in the Family that would lead you to nominate him as the guy who was going to transform television. I mean, he had written for the Martha Raye Show and for Lewis and Martin. And although the company that he formed with Bud Yorkin, Tandem Productions, was very skilled, I mean, they gave us the Andy Williams Show and Come Blow Your Horn and The Night They Raided Minsky's. It was not exactly, Divorce American Style. Divorce American Style with Dick Van Dyke and Debbie Reynolds has moments of showing you that this is a guy who has something to say about the society around him, but really only moments. It's kind of overwhelmed by sitcom cliches. So here's a guy who, as Michael Ovitz, then a young TV agent, said to me in the book, here's a guy who was smarter than his material. Right? He was smarter than what he was producing. And when Bud Yorkin and through some other sources, he gets to see the British sitcom that becomes All in the Family, it instantly detonates with him because it is the same basic story of the bigoted father-in-law, the liberal son and the daughter, then set in the East End of London. And it reminded him of all his conflicts with his father, who was kind of a ne'er-do-well schemer, Herman. So he goes off to make All in the Family and tries originally to sell it to ABC. Does two versions of it, recasting the kids. It was always Edith Stapleton and Carol O'Connor as Archie and Edith. At once in one of those showings for the ABC brass, it's Michael Eisner, a young Michael Eisner, who is running the film machine in the back of the room, as he explained to me. But they had just put on a show. What was the name of the show? I'm going to blank on the name of the show. They had put on a show. ABC had just put on a show by George Schlatter, the inventor of Laugh-In, that was canceled after one episode. And in some places they cut it off even in the middle of the episode. It was kind of a sex farce thing. And I'm sorry, I don't remember the name of it. And they were so burned by that, they felt they couldn't go to the affiliates and say, you ready for this? So All in the Family looked like it was dead in the water. Norman Lear went out and signed a deal with Orion with Arthur Krim, and he was going to do Cold Turkey. He did Cold Turkey, the movie. But they got the movie in front of CBS. I got the pilot in front of CBS. And Robert Wood, although he had canceled, Robert Wood graduated from USC, came up through sales in KNX radio, KNXT here in LA. An interesting closing of the circle because the KNXT newsroom in many ways was the model for Mary Tyler Moore's newsroom. And Mary Tyler Moore's aunt was his secretary. Robert Wood eventually rises to be the head of KNXT. He delivers the editorials on air. He's a very conservative guy. He loves Nixon. He loves Reagan. He hates the student demonstrators. I quote one of his editorials on the student demonstrators. And eventually he's promoted to corporate and he goes to New York and he kind of ascends up that ladder. And as I say, one of the first things he does as CBS president is cancel the Smothers Brothers. But coming out of the urban environment, he was more attuned than most to the pleas that were coming from the business department of all places that were saying we had to get younger, we had to get more urban. And so he wanted something that would, as he said, start a conversation that would kind of put CBS in the discussion. And he put Mary Tyler Moore on the air, gave her the 13, but that was evolutionary, not revolutionary. Its virtues were subtler than All in the Family. And ultimately, he puts All in the Family on the air. He fights tooth and nail with Norman Lear over it in ways that I describe in the book. They even put on this bizarre disclaimer before the first episode, basically warning people that they may be offended by what comes next. I mean, it's sort of like the power of suggestion, you're telling them they may be offended, but he sticks with it. And I tell the story in the book of the first episode becomes kind of the locus of how far CBS was willing to go. And Norman, they basically didn't want him to run the first episode first because they thought it was too much. And Norman was like, we all got to get wet together. We got to jump in the deep end of the pool. And the story of how that got on the air is actually pretty good. So I'm not going to ruin it here, but that's an incredible story. I mean, these two guys, neither one of whom you would have picked to revolutionize television, utterly did exactly that.
And can you talk a little bit about, I mean, I don't know if there's people who really don't know this part, but like, can you talk a little bit about what made this show so mind blowing? Because I mean, you mentioned to me before how like, even when you watch it now,
yes,
and even more when you watch it now, you're like, whoa, hold on.
I went back and watched most of the first season. I actually went to the Paley Center to do it. I guess I could have streamed it, but I went to the Paley Center to do it. And the first episode is like a rock coming through the screen at you. It is unbelievable to hear the things Archie says. And so it was noteworthy immediately for that, right? It was noteworthy because of the language, but in some ways it was more noteworthy because it was grounded in today. Like, who was president during the Lucille Ball show? Or I Love Lucy. Did you know who was president? Maybe one episode ever? Probably not. Mike and Archie argue about Watergate repeatedly. They argue about Nixon. They argue about Vietnam. They argue about life that is happening around them. And I felt that what All in the Family did above all, and that what Mary Tyler Moore did as well, and MASH, but even MASH was through the gauze of Korea, it tore down the wall between the medium and the moment. I mean, television was taking, like, you felt that Archie and Edith and Mike and Gloria were living in the same world you did. And I don't know if you really felt that way about Lucy, and even maybe Ralph Cramden a little bit, but it was very contemporary. And it dealt with contemporary issues, and look, there are some people who got exhausted by it because you're kind of locked in one living room, relitigating the entire generational conflict of the 60s, week after week after week. And, that can get, that can feel hectoring at times. But I think the genius of All in the Family, there are many aspects of genius, but one thing that allowed it to thrive so much was the Smothers Brothers, which, as I said, was CBS's first attempt to kind of connect with contemporary reality. They picked a side. Like, they were on behalf, they were the voice of the younger generation battering down the door. And Norman and the writers and John Rich, the director, may have thought that's what they were doing with Archie, that Mike was always given the better argument. Like John Rich said at one time, the director, Mike always had the better argument. A Black person always had the better argument. But not all the viewers saw it that way. And Norman's sensibility coming out of the sketch comedy of the 50s, which itself was kind of infused with the Catskills, as I say in the book, he kind of presented the agenda of the Woodstock generation with the kind of rhythms of the Catskill generation. And as a result, people on both sides of the generational divide felt at home watching All in the Family. And so it allowed him, I think, to have a broader audience. And, it was at that time a record, the #1 show 5 years in a row, until it was very fittingly dethroned by Happy Days, which takes you back. As I said, people kind of got exhausted relitigating the arguments. That's what happened, I think, we'll talk about all this great pop culture in the mid-70s. But in its day, it allowed all sides of the argument to find a place in that living room. And that's what I think made it such an enormous success.
So let's talk about movies a little bit. You focus a lot on Chinatown and Shampoo. Do you want to talk a little bit about why those were so important to this moment?
Yeah, I think that, thank you for noticing. I mean, Shampoo, first of all, Shampoo and Chinatown were both written by Robert Towne. Shampoo with Beatty. Beatty probably had more impact on kind of the structure of it than Towne, and Towne probably wrote more of the individual lines. It was Beatty's idea to set the movie in Election Eve, 1968. Both of those movies, which seem very different. Chinatown is this labyrinthine, dark, film noir, classic, detective story, and Shampoo is this kind of sex farce. But they're both movies that use an earlier era in LA to underscore the corruption that they believe, is rotting America at that moment. And Chinatown, the betrayals are monstrous and enormous, the incest and the stealing of the water. And in Shampoo, they're smaller and more personal. I mean, everybody is kind of lying to everybody else, and everybody is sleeping with somebody they shouldn't be. But ultimately, there's a lot of parallel to the story. I mean, they're basically about kind of, when I interviewed Robert Towne, he said the message of Chinatown is you don't know as much as you think you do, right? And that what's striking about, one of the things that's striking about Chinatown and makes it very emblematic of early 1970s movies is that the detective never really figures it out until it's too late. The narrator, in that way, it's like Warren's movie, The Parallax View, where you don't know as much as you think you do, and you cause tragedy because of that. And that was a very powerful message in the era of Watergate and the Pentagon Papers and the ITT scandal and everything else that was happening in the early 70s. Until the late 60s, something like 2/3 to 3/4 of Americans said in polls that you could trust the government to do what's right most of the time. People forget, like I said, this is one of those things, like we can't imagine there was a world where that was true, but there was. And Chinatown really captures that. John Huston, the bad guy, Noah Cross, Faye Dunaway's father, says to Jack Nicholson at one point, "You have no idea what you're dealing with." And that was a very resonant message for Americans, I think, in the early 1970s, and why Chinatown and Godfather 2 and Godfather, which have elements of kind of the same kind of messaging in them, struck such a powerful chord. It was the idea like, the scales were being lifted from our eyes. And in Shampoo, it's a little different, but ultimately it gets to the same place because, amid all of the sexual calisthenics of the movie, it kind of ends the same way as Chinatown. Not quite as tragic, but in the end, Warren Beatty's character loses the one woman out of all of them that he loves. She is taken away from him forever by a rich guy, which is pretty much the end of Chinatown. And it is like just this moment of crushing disillusionment. It's set the morning after Nixon's victory. So the political dreams of the 60s are crashing, the hopes of transcendence, the hopes of personal transcendence are crashing. And that was this kind of, it's filmed in 1974 at the moment of Nixon's fall, looking back at the moment of his rise, but really capturing what I write about on the Jackson Browne albums, this kind of awareness that the big changes that we were expecting from the 60s were not going to come. And so how do you find a way to hold on to your ideals and make them relevant in this, and big changes, by which big changes I mean fundamental political reconstruction of the country. In fact, there were big cultural changes that happened. That is the core issue that all of these, I feel like if there's one thread through all of the pop culture of the early 1970s, or all the major pop culture, it is that question. It's like, what of the ideals of the 60s could be preserved in the political environment of the 70s? And it's what a lot of the music grapples with, is what Chinatown and Shampoo grapple with, giving a pretty negative answer in each case. And certainly it's what the great TV grapples with.
So let's talk some music. Well, I feel like since the Jackson Browne song, Rock Me on the Water,
Yeah.
your actual title, we can sort of use that to talk about the music in general. Can you talk about why that song, why he was so seminal at that time?
Yeah. So Rock Me on the Water originally attracted me because if you've heard the song lately, I mean, it just sounds like LA. I'm going to get down to the sea. The sisters of the sun are going to rock me on the water. And I think, you know, to me, it initially conveyed like driving down the Santa Monica freeway in a convertible with a surfboard, you know, kind of sticking out the back, going down the California incline, sun glistening off the water, Saturday afternoon, you know, to borrow Neil Young, get into the surf on time. That's what originally attracted me to the song. And it kind of captured that sense of openness that I described before that was such a critical part of what was happening in LA in those years. But as I went on and I got deeper into the, the research, and this deeper current of the book became apparent about kind of the cultural turning point here of the pop culture of early 70s LA, excuse me, hold on a second. The song became even more relevant because it turns out Rock Me on the Water on Jackson Browne's first album is the first of 3 songs he writes on each of his first 3 albums, grappling directly with the question of what from the 60s could be preserved in the 1970s. And Rock Me on the Water, he's at his most optimistic. And there's the great line in the song, "Oh, people, look among you. It's there your hope must lie." He's basically counting on collective action to make this a better place. By the second album, For Every Man, every man is his metaphor for the collective social action of the 60s. And on For Every Man, he's waiting now for every man. And he's not ready, you know, he's not ready to join his friends who are giving up and kind of leaving, you know, society because they think it's all going to go to hell. He still holds out hope. He's waiting for just another dreamer dreaming about every man. And he allows that he may be left holding sand, but he's not ready to give up yet. Then the third album, the one that I really write about the most, is the one that he puts out in 1974, which is, I think, like the Linda Ronstadt album of 74, like the Joni Mitchell album of 74, like the Eagles album, is the turning point in his career. But the song there is Before the Deluge. And by Before the Deluge, there's almost no hope, right? I mean, even his generation has, you know, their wings have grown torn and tattered, and, you know, the resignation that living brings. And it's just, he doesn't see a way forward, and everything is just going to get washed away in this biblical ecological catastrophe. And it gets even darker on the next album, The Pretender, which of course is after the death of his wife, Phyllis Major. And he sings, "I want to know what became of the changes we waited for love to bring," which again, his metaphor for the social change of the 60s, "were they only the fitful dreams of some greater awakening?" So in that way, he traces this arc from optimism to pessimism. But the interesting thing is the story doesn't end there. And as he goes forward in his life and his career, he finds ways to translate that idealism into his career and to new causes that he cares about. And in that way, I think he is parallel and reflecting the experience of millions of people who participated in the social movements. I write about Hayden and Fonda in here, Tom Hayden and Jane Fonda, who go through a very similar progression to what Jackson Browne writes about in his songs, or even that kind of Beatty expresses in Shampoo. So the music, I think, you know, captures this similar question, and it's not always overtly political like the movies. Something like Our House or the Joni, you know, or the Joni Mitchell songs. It's really how it's sort of like the answer to the scene in The Graduate, where, you know, one word for you, Benjamin, plastics. The music is really about how do we find a more authentic way to live. Joni Mitchell said, how do we, you know, get our way back to the garden in Woodstock? And that, so for some people, that's hitting the road, that's Take It Easy. You know, it's a lot of the Eagles songs. For others, it's finding domesticity. But it is all really about that question. How do we find a more authentic way to live than what we see our parents' generation doing?
And there are a lot of this is like white men doing stuff, yeah, right? Which is the nature of 1974. But you do also write about the difficulties and kind of some of the, you know, leaps forward that we were making in terms, yep, of women and people of color in the industry. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, and this is where I get to ask you a question also when I finish saying what I'm going to say. I'm going to ask you a question. So the story of the early 1970s in this respect is, on the one hand, the door cracks open to the telling of the stories of protagonists who are not only white men and white people in general. I mean, so you get Good Times and Jeffersons, and you get Mary Tyler Moore as a single white woman, and you get Alice Doesn't Live Here Anymore, and you start to see the Chico and the Man and Sanford and Son. The U.S. Commission on Civil Rights came and did a study on Hollywood in the early 1970s, and I think they said that 1 out of every 8 shows TV shows had a recurring non-white character in 1973, 74, and that was basically double what it had been only a few years earlier. So, but it was double, and there was the door was cracking open to telling the stories of a more diverse America. The problem was the people who were telling those stories were still overwhelmingly older white men. And the door cracked open very little for women to be directors or writers, or people of color to be directors or writers, except it is one very odd, controversial, polarizing kind of sub category of the blaxploitation movies of the early 1970s, Shaft and Superfly and all the Pam Coffey movies. And some people celebrated those movies because they provided a lot of work for Black actors, writers, directors, craftspeople, and also because the protagonists, the stars, were independent and confident. Like in the Pam Grier movies, in Coffee and Foxy Brown, I mean, she takes vengeance on corrupt white America in a way that would have been inconceivable 5 or 7 years earlier. She also spent half the movie with her top off. So it's like that was the other side of it. There was this there were intense protests against it by civil rights groups who thought they were all demeaning and promoting stereotypes. But except for that, with that as kind of a very asterisky exception, very few women were writing for television. Even on Mary Tyler Moore, it was pretty modest. On All in the Family, it was almost non-existent. Joan Darling was just about the only woman who directed a TV. I was trying to remember if a woman ever directed an episode of All in the Family. I think the answer is no. I think the number of episodes written by a woman was probably 20 or less out of a 10+ year season. So this is where I get to ask you a question. What happened to roll back the inroads that you wrote about?
I mean, I think that, you sort of even hinted at this here to some extent that there were women being hired on the Mary Tyler Moore Show to write episodes, way more than we had ever seen before. But it was still Jim Brooks and Alan Burns' show, which makes sense, right? Those are the people who had the connections to even get the gigs to begin with. That's why Norman Lear is doing his thing over there. So there was so much crossover. When you were just talking about this, I was laughing because I was thinking about what they did is they all went between the Mary Tyler Moore Show and Maude.
Yes.
Because those were where the women were most needed, which is good because at least then they're reflecting women's real experiences. But there was this kind of feeling, there's even a Mary Tyler Moore Show episode about this, that they would bring, she gets promoted and then she says, oh, they just bring tour groups by and say, this is our woman executive. There was a lot of that going on at the time. There was this great piece in TV Guide about Susan Silver, one of the female writers for Mary Tyler Moore. And the headline was, "The writer wears hot pants." And it's which she brilliantly titled her own memoir. I think that's great. Right. But there was sort of this little surge that you're mentioning, which was better than before, I guess, which was almost nothing in the 50s and 60s, right? So you're getting there, but it's it's that thing where there's these little surges where even the same thing with Black representation, I think, on television, where it's almost like a trend more than it's something that sticks with us. So that's why even now, when we have more than we ever have before, I still am I think things have really changed now. And certainly streaming changes things, but I'm still cautious because we've had these little waves. We had a Cosby wave too in the 80s, right? When they still called it ethnic comedy in memos, but that this was, but they would treat it as a niche rather than as a little trend, the same way you might have, I don't know, a bunch of shows about circuses all of a sudden, and then you don't. I don't know if that ever happened. I just made that.
One thing I really felt after interviewing both writers and directors and some of the early generation of executives like Sherry Lansing was that it was very clear to them that part of the rules of getting in the room was accepting the rules that kept most women out of the room. I mean, it was like there was very little room, and Sherry Lansing said to me, there was not really a sense of solidarity. It was kind of like there was going to be one woman in the room, and you wanted to be that woman. But it was very hard. And people did, as the decade went on, I think, push more. I mean, they had to fight to get the right to use the gym at the studio at MGM. But it was something where the position and the women directors, when there were so few women directors, and Joan Tewksbury or Joan Darling or others would say to me, basically, you got one shot. Mm-hmm. And if it didn't work, that was the Sugarland Express was not an unmitigated success. Steven Spielberg's first movie, right. And he got another shot, and he produced Jaws out of it. But she was saying, Joan Tewksbury said to me, who wrote Nashville, and later when it took her years to try to direct her own movie, and in a very revealing story, she wrote Nashville. Alan Rudolph was the second unit director on Nashville. And Altman, after Nashville, basically said to both of them, okay, this is it. This is the moment. If you got a project, let's do it. And he got Rudolph's project made, but not hers. He, and was able to do that. Maybe was even more comfortable doing that. And there was a sense that you were on a ledge, even when you got in there. There wasn't a lot of wiggle room. And Elaine May was a cautionary tale, and who was brought in as a director earlier, but kind of pushed out very quickly. And so I think people felt that it was very contingent. I'm not sure that's that different now. I mean, but it then certainly it was.
Yeah, and especially if you didn't want to write for the women's show, you mentioned being, I feel like All in the Family would, I don't think you could have gotten a better credit at the time.
Yes.
It was still this very kind of male, and it's like, no, send the women over to write for Maude, right? And I don't even know if they had Black people writing for the Jeffersons,
They by and large, it was pretty minimal. In fact, Norman was picketed. He was given an award at a civil rights dinner in '75 and was picketed by Black screenwriters.
Yeah, that just was completely unheard of. Whereas at least they were mentoring some women over at Mary Tyler Moore. And to be honest, a huge reason was simply because Jim and Alan were sticklers for realism more than that, because they kind of actually said it to me, explicitly, because just, I think there was also this feeling of you never wanted to be doing something feminist. And they also wanted to say these women were really qualified, but we did have to mentor them, and we did really want them to share their experiences, because we were not single women in the 70s, we're married men in the 70s, so they really, it was partly just their commitment to, authenticity that made them do this.
I was going to say that on some of the Lear shows, the roles of single women were being written by married men in their 70s, maybe 60s. Maude was dominated by, older, anyway, but that was kind of the paradox of the period. And the door was cracking open in terms of front of the camera and the stories that were being told, but the people who were controlling those stories were still pretty much the same people who had always controlled them.
Right. Well, before we take some questions, how did it all end? It kind of starts to wither by the end of 1974 already.
Yeah. Right. Look, there are a variety of forces that come together. You see on TV the first stirrings of what would become the religious right, backlashes against kind of the greater expression on TV, which ultimately produces this idea called the family hour that really destroys the contemporary comedies, even though it's ultimately rescinded and they win a lawsuit against it. In movies, it's too simple, but not entirely wrong to say that the blockbuster does kind of pull the rug out from the early 70s auteur type movies, because it shows that the roulette wheel could pay off much bigger than ever before. And in music, you see the musical current kind of bifurcate. On the one hand, you get something that's kind of harder edged and even more nihilistic than what's coming out of LA, which is the punk movement that starts to develop in '75. And '75 is the release of Blood on the Tracks and Born to Run. That's a pretty good year. I read a whole book about those two. But that's kind of a harder edged than the LA sound. And the LA sound, I think, was very much the California dream of the early 70s was the 60s dream of kind of peace, love, and personal liberation, however you define that. And in the mid 70s, music kind of bifurcated between, on the one hand, that tougher edge, but also kind of the disco variant, which was kind of in its own way, Happy Days and Jaws and Star Wars, just kind of entertainment. I want to be entertained again. Stop. And really, that to me is the bottom line of the whole thing, which is that the great art of the early 70s was grappling with that central question of what of the 60s could be preserved. And I think by 75, the audience wasn't really ready to keep arguing about that anymore. And it wasn't like, as I said, it wasn't like they were going back to square one, right? I mean, we weren't going back to the Donna Reed show, and literally in the way we lived. We were not going back to, nor are we going back to trusting everything you heard from your government. So the change that was embodied in this early 70s culture proved lasting, but the willingness to keep kind of debating it back and forth, I think, diminished. And in fact, ABC had a memo at the time saying people were just tired of essentially arguing this out anymore, and they wanted to now maybe that was self-justifying to argue for Happy Days on the one hand, and then the titillation jiggle comedies on the other, Three's Company and Charlie's Angels. But that, I think, was the common thread, is it was, and the Eagles kind of, that's what Hotel California is about. It's sort of like, we haven't had that spirit here since 1969.
Do we want to take some questions?
I totally want to take some questions.
Jennifer, can I ask the first question? But before I do, two things. First, I spoke to Irving Azoff about your book, and he said, congratulations, he got it mostly right, which, knowing Irving Azoff, is
That's
high
pretty
praise.
good. Yeah.
Secondly, when we had Norman Lear here, Norman said he wasn't trying to make great cultural change, but rather was trying to get his show on CBS. So sometimes
he actually said he went one step further. He was trying to get a show with he was trying to get a show he could syndicate.
Right.
I mean, that's what he was trying to do. He wanted a sitcom because back then, the payoff, as Seinfeld, as Jennifer probably knows better than that, was at the ultimate, the highest ever. I mean, you could sell these things for enormous sums of money to stations to run at 7 o'clock and 6:30 and 11 and all that. And that was, and he said to me, I didn't watch Petticoat Junction. I didn't know how different this was than what they were doing. I think he may be slightly overstating that. I think they had to, the reaction by everyone around them, was that this was really different. And Rob Reiner, I think, certainly saw it as really different. Carol O'Connor was in such endemic conflict with Norman from day one that I'm not sure exactly how he saw it. I mean, he thought All in the Family was the Jackie Gleason show. I mean, he thought it was the Carol O'Connor show. And there's one remarkable moment in an interview. There's an interview he does with Playboy. And by the way, the Playboy interviews are a great, the interview with Jack Nicholson, with Hayden and Fonda, with Polanski, they're really a great period piece, because at that point, this was seen as the place to go unburden yourself. It was kind of the Oprah in some ways of its day. And Carol O'Connor gives this interview to Playboy. First of all, he answers like 40 minutes worth of questions about what Archie would think about this or that, like presenting himself as the authority on Archie. And then at one point, he talks about something he didn't like in one of the scripts. I think it was Archie ends up kissing Mrs. Jefferson under the mistletoe. And he goes on this long kind of a rant, really, basically saying, if this was the Lucille Ball show, if this was a Jackie Gleason show, I would have just said, change it, and it would have gotten changed, or they would have gotten fired, right? And I am the star, and basically they should be deferring to me. And as Rob Reiner said to me, the problem was, no matter how much he wanted it to be the Carol O'Connor show, it wasn't. It was, if anything, the Norman Lear show. And, they fought about this really throughout, and never really reconciled after the show. Bob Daly, later the president of CBS, told me that when they were going from All in the Family to Archie's place, he had to listen to like a 90-minute tirade about how unfair Norman Lear had been to him before they could get up to discussing the practicalities of putting Archie's place on the air. So, that was kind of the underbelly of the All in the Family story.
Could each of you just talk about how you got to your subject? Jennifer, you wrote about these four very different but very important women, and Ron, of course, you covered the waterfront. How did you decide to spend your time researching, writing, and doing what you did?
Jennifer?
Well, I stumbled on mine. There's actually a bridge right here because I stumbled on my subject matter for when women invented television first when I was researching the Mary Tyler Moore Show for my book, Mary and Lou and Rhoda and Ted. And there were two little tidbits that came up. One was that I asked Jim and Ellen, the co-creators of the show, about inspirations for Rhoda, Mary's best friend, who's also openly Jewish. And it was kind of a big deal at the time. I mean, they were still saying literally in meetings for Mary Tyler Moore, like, nobody wants to see Jews on television is what they told them in the early.
Or mustaches.
Or as it turned out, the reason they were saying it, divorced people, because they wanted to make Mary divorced at first. So I asked about inspirations for her, and they named several people, but one that they named was Gertrude Berg's character on her show, The Goldbergs, in the 1950s, Molly Goldberg. She is this great Jewish mother character and bold, and it's about a family that lives in a Bronx tenement, and she's really the center of the show. And so that was, and a city woman, she's in New York. So all of those things kind of went into Rhoda, among other things. And I thought, like, that's crazy that I don't know that woman. Like, I don't know who this person is. And she wrote, starred in, created, directed everything this show in the 1950s before Lucy. And that was the first, like, huh. And then the other thing that they mentioned was, we were talking about Betty White's character, the happy homemaker, Sue Ann Nimmons, who is kind of this, like, sickly sweet, as they said, character on screen when she is playing the happy homemaker within the show. And then the minute the cameras go off, she's, a different kind of person, which is not true of Betty. But what they did say was that the persona on screen was inspired by Betty. They said they called her a Betty White type in the script before they even cast her. And I thought, I have no idea what do you mean by that? Because I only knew her first from Mary Tyler Moore. So they said, oh yeah, she had this whole other career. And it turned out, indeed, she is one of the first daytime talk show hosts ever in Los Angeles. She was on the air for 5.5 hours a day, 6 days a week. Oh. They didn't know what to do during the day on television at the time. So they were like, put Betty White on, and she was improvising without scripts that entire time. So that was very intriguing to me as well. And once I started digging, I ran into the fact that there were just so many more women doing things pre-Lucille Ball than I had ever known. I always thought Lucy was the outlier. Like, isn't it incredible that, TV's Big Bang was also a woman, when in fact she is incredible and she was a genius, but it's not as surprising as you think that she was a woman. And so that was sort of the story that I wanted to tell. And from there, figured out some other women to add into the mix.
I'm trying to process that Betty White was the Wolf Blitzer of the 1950s on TV.
That's a perfect. I mean, from you, that makes sense.
I'm going to have to tell him that. So my story was kind of like a layer cake or an archaeological dig. I mean, it definitely occurred in segments. As I mentioned, I wrote that book, The Power and the Glitter: A History of the Relationship Between Hollywood and Politics. And anybody who writes about Hollywood, you don't have to get very far before you learn that the period roughly from Bonnie and Clyde and The Graduate through the mid 70s is considered the second golden age in Hollywood history, along with roughly Wizard of Oz to It's a Wonderful Life around World War II, or Gone with the Wind, It's a Wonderful Life. And so I had that kind of in my mental back pocket when I moved back. I've kind of bounced back and forth between living in LA and Washington, mostly in Washington. And I moved back to LA in 2014. So when I got here, I kind of knew that. And I started listening more to, when I got back out here, to the LA sound of the late 60s and early 70s, Crosby, Stills, Nash & Young and Joni Mitchell and the Eagles and Jackson Browne and Ronstadt. And I remember kind of thinking, that's kind of interesting. All that's happening kind of at the same time. I wonder if they kind of knew each other. But the last tumbler clicked into place. I don't remember exactly when it was, but it was probably late 2015. I went to a political event at Norman Lear's house, maybe 2016, where for Elizabeth Warren, who was just starting to kind of put herself out nationally. And I remember as we were driving home thinking, you know, he was doing All in the Family at the same time that they were doing Chinatown, and the Eagles and Jackson Browne were kind of at the peak of their wave. And I said, there may be a book here. And, you know, just show people a little behind the scenes. You were talking, Jennifer, I can't remember if we were on the air or off the air, where you were saying about how you kind of honed down to your list of 4 characters. Now, I kind of did the same thing. I have sheets of a legal pad, like in the, you know, in the dresser over here, where I kind of looked at each year, you know, and try to figure out which year was the most representative. Like, was it 1971? Was it 72, 73, 74? It takes a while to kind of hone in on the specific. But I think once I recognized that all of this was happening at once, and then adding in, once I settled on 74 with Jerry Brown coming forward to replace Ronald Reagan, which is just like a perfect embodiment of All in the Family, replacing, you know, the Clampetts. It's the same kind of generational transition. I knew I had a story, and it was really fun to, I've written other books. This was really fun to write. I mean, it really felt like it was a labor of love, because I think this was a great moment in LA. People are not used to thinking about LA in terms of like Paris in the 20s or the New York modern art world in the 50s. It sounds even kind of heretical to say it, but I think if you line up Norman Lear, Larry Gelbart, James L. Brooks, Mary Tyler Moore, Alan Alda, Carol O'Connor, and then you start getting to Arthur Penn, Bob Rafelson, you know, Robert Altman, Steven Spielberg, Martin Scorsese, Jackson Browne, Linda Ronstadt, the Eagles, Joni Mitchell, all in the same place at the same time, at the absolute top of their game. You are talking about an historic constellation of talent in a place where people are not always accustomed to acknowledging that. End of speech.
Kelsey, any questions?
We just had a couple come through in the chat. One on the tangent, asking if your next book will be about the scene in New York in the 60s and 70s.
You know, I grew up in New York in the 60s and 70s, and I had a line in the book: you could write an alternative history of the early 70s from lower New York, which was much lower East Side New York, which was much darker. I mean, LA was kind of open, and jeans and cowboy boots and blonde groupies, and New York in that era, you know, as we start to get the New York Dolls and Patti Smith, is kind of like, you know, dark avenues, you know, little stench of urine coming from the alleys, newspapers. I remember taking the subway home at night, newspapers blowing through the subways, graffiti, combat boots, transvestites. So that's a different kind of take on the early 1970s, but I don't know if I'm quite ready to plunge back in to another book. I do like writing history more than I like writing a book about kind of the here. I don't think any of my books, I'm trying to remember, I guess one of my books was about the here and now, but I think it's hard to understand the here and now fully. And we do our best every day, first draft of history and all that. But for the book stuff, I think I'd rather have something looking back, and I don't know what that's going to be yet.
Other questions?
Yes, 2 questions, very similar to each other's. Is there any TV show, album, or film from 1974 that echoed the themes of political questioning that failed to catch on with audiences that you feel deserves another look?
I think Nashville, probably. You know, I mean, Nashville has kind of vanished for people. And it's not a perfect movie. It's not the best movie of the early 1970s. But I feel like it's the Moby Dick of the early 1970s. It is the attempt to wrestle in one place all of the big themes of the time. And it's this kind of shipwreck, as Joan Tewksbury, who wrote it, described it to me. And you realize you're kind of floating out there with all of this stuff around you. And I think that to understand the strains that were tugging at America in the early 1970s, I feel like Chinatown is, you know, Chinatown and The Two Godfathers are probably the best movies of the early 1970s. But Nashville in some ways is the one that tries to get it all in on one canvas. And in the same way, I'd say All in the Family, even more than Mary Tyler Moore or MASH, as great as they are, Mary Tyler Moore is probably the most effective character study. And Jennifer, feel free to weigh in. MASH is probably the greatest. I mean, Larry Gelbart is unparalleled in just writing, Groucho-y dialogue. But All in the Family encompasses the whole thing in one package.
Yeah, All in the Family is like, especially you have to remember they didn't have internet then, which seems like a crazy thing to say maybe, but like, it kind of feels like it was Twitter for its time in some ways, in maybe the best ways.
Yeah.
But right, like it's like it was really that people didn't have a forum like that to discuss stuff like this through their pop culture. This was such a big deal. Like you said, it was kind of ripped from the headlines. Whereas like, I love Mary Tyler Moore. And I think what's really remarkable about it is that it holds up so well. Like you can go watch it now. If you told kids that's a period piece about the 1970s written now, you might believe it. It's just perfect. It's like, but it's so much more, it's almost trying to be timeless. Whereas All in the Family is trying to be a document of its time.
It's more interior also. Yeah, it's more interior. Yeah.
Fashion's better on the Mary Tyler Moore show though.
Oh man, I just watched the beginning of the season and All in the Family, 73, 74. 73, 74 is the one year, another reason why I picked 74. 73, 74 is the one year that All in the Family, MASH, Mary Tyler Moore are all together, along with Bob Newhart and Carol Burnett, a pretty good lineup that has been called the greatest night in television history. But watching the first episodes of that year and All in the Family, they definitely needed some fashion consulting from Mike and Gloria. All I will say.
Yeah.
Kelsey, one last question, then Jennifer has to go to bed. It's 10 o'clock in New York.
All right, let's, for our last questions, take one from Rick. Is there anything you left out that you wish you had included?
Well, if this is for both of us, I'd be interested in Jennifer's. Let's see. Yes, the answer is yes. Although I'm not sure I wish I included it because, my editor's argument was stick with your main characters and don't, the cast could be infinite. So there are really interesting asides about, I had written a few pages about James Aubrey, who was the head of CBS in the 60s, who was this kind of sociopathic character who was the one who put Beverly Hillbillies and all of that on stage, on TV. I wrote a little more about some of the other movies. I wrote more about The Godfather. But, in retrospect, I'm not sure the world needed more about The Godfather. I wrote a little more about Fleetwood Mac, which makes a cameo appearance at the end. And I wrote a little more about Stevie Nicks and Lindsey Buckingham, who have their nose to the glass of all of this. I mean, she's still working as a waitress in a flapper restaurant, if you can believe it, in Beverly Hills, which a friend of mine, a director, said he went to. He doesn't remember if he saw her while all this is happening. So I kind of had more about them. But I think, what ended up coming through with a very able assistance of my editor and direction, I guess assistance is the wrong word, direction of my editor, are the figures who most contributed to my central storyline, which was about the change in popular culture that was engineered through the art that was produced in LA in the 70s. So yeah, I mean, there could be a director's cut, but like, as a big Lord of the Rings fan, I watched the director's cut of all three of those movies, and I'm not sure there was a single scene in any of them that had to be there. And I guess I feel the same way about the book.
Jennifer.
I kind of have a similar answer, which is that I too tried to focus on my four women who were Hazel Scott, Gertrude Berg, Betty White, and Erna Phillips, who created the soap opera. But there were a bunch of other women who were on my original list who kind of like get a sentence or a paragraph or whatever, and could make their own whole books, et cetera, et cetera. So, I mean, I can just name quickly a few. One was Faye Emerson, who had one of the first late night talk shows, which is sort of mind-boggling given that it's been so impossible in like my lifetime to get a woman on late night, but there was a woman on late night when it was just emerging is incredible. And she was successful and glamorous and amazing. And Amanda Randolph, who was a Black woman. She was the first Black woman to star in a sitcom. She played like an affable maid to this white family, of course, because that's what they would come up with. But she was a real kind of like, she just had this big personality and seemed really fun from the clips that I saw of her. And she actually had like one of the first daytime talk shows in New York City that was local. And one of my big characters is Hazel Scott, who was the first Black person to have a primetime national show. She was a jazz musician. She's an incredible figure, but she was super glamorous and all of this stuff. And when Amanda Randolph had her daytime show before Hazel Scott, she was being paid something ridiculous, like $5 a week. And she said, her quip to some interviewer was, well, for $5 a week, what can they expect, Hazel Scott? Who eventually did get a similar gig. And I think she was being paid quite a bit more than that. But Amanda Randolph was a real pioneer in television as a Black woman, but just even as a person being on television, period. And seems like she was a lot of fun as well, but I only got to do a few paragraphs on her.
Kelsey, before we wrap it up, will you tell everybody how they can buy these 2 wonderful books? And then I will thank Ron and Jennifer for this really wonderful evening. I started by saying how excited I was. You have exceeded my expectations, and thank you very, very much. I really greatly appreciate it.
Yeah.
Thanks, Bert. So there's a couple of ways everyone can get both Ron and Jennifer's books. You can either visit us in store if you're in LA and you feel comfortable visiting. Chevalier's is open for distance and mass browsing. You can also drop us a line at chevaliersbooks@gmail.com or check out our listings on bookshop.org. We have links to both Ron and Jennifer's books on our website.
And can I just thank you guys for hosting us, and Jennifer, thank you for participating and asking such great questions. And Bert, thanks for the forum. Thanks for the hall.
Thanks a lot. Really appreciate it.
Thank you all. I can't wait to visit when I'm finally back in LA someday soon.
Look forward to welcoming you. Thanks again.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Good night.